Well, hello everyone. So this video is not gonna be a camera review. I have plenty of camera reviews on my film photography playlist. So if you guys are interested, feel free to check out the playlist on the top right corner. But this video, we are comparing two very handy, very pocketable light meter options. And both of those light meters are from Sekonic, which is a Japanese light meter manufacturer that makes quite a lot of well-known light meters for the film industry and the video or the movie industry. But the one on my right-hand side is the Sekonic Auto Leader L-188. And on my left-hand side is the Sekonic Twin Mate L-208. This light meter probably came out 30-40 years before the Twin Mate L-208. However, each light meter have their pros and cons. Personally, I actually like the older version or the older design of the Auto Leader 188. And but I think in terms of usability, the Twin Mate L-208 is gonna suit a lot more photographers' needs. Okay, so let's get started. So both of them as you can see, the interface are extremely similar. They all have a blue area, which is your battery indicator. So the battery level indicator, if you look at the back, there's a button over there. You press on those buttons, they're gonna bring the needle to the battery level area. If it's in blue, that means the battery is nice and fresh and it's gonna give you an accurate reading. Over here, the same thing. If you press this battery check, boom, it goes all the way to the end. So very freshly charged. In terms of battery, the older L-188 uses a single cell R44 or SR44. Personally, I prefer the SR44, which is a silver oxide 1.55 volt batteries. Those batteries actually gives slightly more voltage kick, so the needle would actually move slightly above the blue area. If I use the LR44, the needle only stops at the kind of the leading area of the indicator over here for the Sekonic L-188. And this one uses the modern, long-lasting lithium CR2032. It's a very common battery that you can get nowadays. Slightly more expensive cost per cell per battery, but this one actually is supposed to last you much longer in terms of battery life, in theory. Okay, both of those light meters comes in a pouch. This one, again, being probably 20-30 years older than the other one, the pouch actually is nice and well made. And there's a little hole on the back. You can probably put your string. This is not the original string, but you can put the holding string through the hole, so it always protects it. When you don't need it, you just slide it back into the pocket. Very nice and easy. This pocket is slightly more modern. It's like a felt material, like a microfiber material. And it holds this light meter pretty nicely in here. And you can tighten it up so it doesn't bump into things, as such. So very nice and good pouches for both of the light meters. In terms of the size, as you can see, the older one, the L-188, is slightly bigger or slightly longer and slightly wider. If you look at the profile, this is a size difference of the older one and the new one. The new one is more compact. But in terms of volume, if you look at the side profile, the new 208 is actually much thicker. So it's like a little chunky, small, short boy, and this one is tall and slim. That's a feel. But both of those feels really good in your hands. They just give you a different feeling, but they all feel really nice. And again, I mentioned that the top area is very similar. So what they does is, and again, those meters works exceptionally simple. You press the button on the side, and it brings the needle to an area where you're gonna line up this little green dial by turning the outer dial on the bottom to match that needle. Once you're done on the 188, you just release a button, and it goes back to sleep mode. On the 208, you press the button. The cool thing is you don't have to hold the button there. The button is gonna stay in the place. So, and the interesting thing is it actually, I don't know if it's my unit or not, but when I first press the button, it's gonna give me a reading slightly below the actual readout over there. I don't know what is the reason, but it does give me a different readout the first time I press the button. I have to press 2 times to get to the same reading as my 188. So that's pretty weird. But the plus side for the 208 is, as you can see, when you press the button, it stays there for about 10 seconds. So you have time to slowly move your needle there. And once the 10-second passes, the needle goes to sleep. So in terms of, user friendliness, the 208 is definitely better designed. It holds a needle, and it's much easier to get your readings up there with a one-hand operation. This one, I kind of have to hold this and use the other hand to turn. Otherwise, if I lose it, or I can try with my one hand, but it's kind of hard to turn, as you can see. So you gotta have 2 hands. With the 208, one hand is possible. So again, as you can see, I have to press 2 times to get there. It's more convenient in terms of getting the reading on the 208. Now, this is how you get a reading. If we look at the dial, both of those dials operates, pretty similar. It operates, I would say, exact same way. First, you set your ISO by turning the little knob over here, and on the 208 is a little notch. So let's do a quick test. So we're gonna test on ISO 400. So we're gonna turn this dial on the inner plate to match the 400 setting by pointing that 400 dial over there. And it also gives you the DIN reading, which is, older standards, I guess, or like a European standards. But you have the option of the DIN reading as well. So DIN 27, which is ISO 400. And they also call it ASA, but that's actually ISO, okay? So you get the ISO set, and now you take a reading. And again, 2-hand operation, you turn the dial here, have the needle all the way at the center, then you lose it. You can look at a full aperture readout, which is really convenient. And of course, in that sense, a full shutter speed readout. So if you use shutter speed priority, that's great. You can see the shutter that you set, and you can set the aperture you want. And for me personally, I use aperture priority most of the time on my auto exposure cameras. But on my manual camera, again, that's probably when I need both of those light meters. On my manual camera, again, you have a full readout corresponding to every aperture and shutter speed combination you can use in a very nicely easy to read way. Okay, so that's an advantage. Personally, I think for me, in a analog light meter is that you have a full readout for quickly setting shutter speed or the aperture according to your needs and your creative control. Now, and the 208, it's gonna work exactly the same, okay? It's gonna work exactly the same. So let's try it on the 208 as well. So again, I haven't figured out what's going on with single press. It gives me a lower reading, and I double press, and I press again, gives me the actual reading that's corresponding to my 188. So let's give it a try. See, that's just weird. But again, I'm gonna line up that little green button over there, and I think we forgot to set our ISO speed. So make sure you set your ISO speed corresponding to your film before you start rotating the exterior dial. Okay, so all right, we also set the film speed to ISO 400, and we already line up the green dial to the indicator. Now we don't have to worry about the top, you just look at the dial. Also gives you a beautiful layout of every aperture combination that this light meter gives you. Very practical, actually. gives you from f1.4 all the way to f32. Now some macro lens would have f32, but I don't think any of the older lenses would go even as high as f22. Like some of my lens only goes to f16. Okay, but then again, if you have a faster lens, say f1.2 or f1, f0.9, then this light meter obviously is not going to suit you. But then if you have money to buy those super expensive lens, then you probably have money to afford for a much fancier digital light meter. Okay. Anyway, let's go back here. So let's see the reading, see if it actually corresponds to the other one. I think the easiest way is to actually read the EV value right here. So this one I have an EV value of around 12, and this one, the reading I got is around 13. So definitely there's a discrepancy. So I'm going to actually point both of those cameras to a white wall over there and see if they actually are corresponding to both of those readings. So obviously, as you can see, even if I pointed to the exact same subject, those light meter actually gives me different readings. That is when you actually, if you have a really good and reliable camera, another way to test is use your camera. Like I have an Olympus OM4 Ti, which has a very cool spot metering mode. So I'm actually going to use this camera to meter the white wall over there and then get another reading. And I'm going to tell you guys which reading from those sensors is actually more accurate. Okay. All right. So in my camera, I got a 250th of a second reading. So let's see, 250th of a second reading at f4. And this is ISO 400 speed film that I have in here. Let's see which meter is actually more close to the camera. Okay. So at f4, this one gives me like an in-between between 250 and 500. So this one is, nope, not accurate according to the camera. And this one gives me the exact same reading as my Olympus OM4 Ti. So in this sense, I would say actually this older meter, which uses a older sensor, it's a CDS sensor built in here, is actually more accurate than the new meter with the new silicon blue cell diode sensor. And I can't explain why this one is more accurate than this one. But if we know a base value that is actually accurate, then we can kind of compensate for the error in the reading on the 208 by just using the ISO dial. So I am going to just line up the f4 with 250 by changing my ISO setting. Unfortunately, I got this light meter used, and I don't know any history about this light meter. So now it's good to know that it's actually less accurate than my 40-year-old light meter, okay, which is really interesting. So, and then we look at the corresponding ISO right here. So I guess I have to actually overexpose, or I have to overcompensate the ISO here by giving it an ISO speed of like 320 to get the same rating as the correctly working light meter. Okay, that's just unfortunate. But again, now I know I don't have to care about that. And if you look, it's going to give the same EV rating as well. Okay, once it's calibrated. I wish I can find a way to actually calibrate the needles so I don't have to adjust the ISO dial. And I'm sure there's a way to calibrate this as well. Okay, we'll have to find out in a later video on how to calibrate your light meter. Now, let's go back to light meters. Again, we compared the features. They are pretty much exactly the same. The cool thing about the older L-188 is it actually gives the film speed readout as well. So it's going to give you a proper frame rates per second. suggestion on top. And obviously this light meter is mainly designed for photography, still photography, but they still give you this nice readout for movie mode. I guess for people who used to shoot the Super 8 style movies, or they shoot 16mm movies, this would be a helpful light meter for them as well. If you look here, this light meter, again, is very dedicated to still photography. And it's very practical because it gives you the practical aperture settings for any practical cameras, modern day cameras, vintage cameras. It's got settings for everything. And the old light meter, the 188, if you look at the maximum shutter speed that this one is able to calculate, it only goes to 0.002 of a second. But the cool thing is it goes to as low as 8 seconds readout right here. So 8 seconds all the way to 0.002 of a second. That's a shutter speed for older cameras usually, or the shutter speed options. But if you look over here, this one is cool because it does give you the f1 aperture reading. So if you have an f1 lens or f0.9, which is pretty similar, pretty much like f1, you can actually get a accurate reading for f1 lens. Okay, pretty nice. And the aperture readout goes all the way to 64. So f64 is possible. I know some of the macro lens or probably some of the large format cameras, you would be able to use f64. So again, this light meter back in the day is geared towards advanced users. So it's give you the film reading and it's give you the much wider aperture range. And again, all the shutter speeds possible back in the day, they also give you this option. So pretty nice, pretty nice. If you look at this one, again, obviously it's designed for entry-level photography. So it does give you modern day shutter speeds all the way up to 0.008 of a second. But then think again, modern day cameras all use auto exposure. So I guess 0.008 of a second is kind of a gimmick. And in terms of slow speeds, it gives you a reading all the way to 30 seconds, which is actually useful. So in that regard, this is more practical for general film photography. And this is more practical for anybody who have vintage gears that want to use vintage stuff and large format camera. The L-188 is going to be much more useful compared to 208. One thing that 208 put into the design thought is they actually have an attachment, which I don't have when I got this used. The attachment to mount this onto a hot shoe of a older camera that does not have a built-in light meter. So think of the Leica M4, M4P, M3. Those does not have a built-in light meter. So those old rangefinder cameras, you're going to find this meter a lot more useful compared to the handheld one, because then you don't have to actually use two hands to do your metering. You can just mount this on top of the camera. Granted, it's not the prettiest looking meter right here, but you have that option, okay? But I think for most general photography, people would probably just use this, hold it on the hand, get a reading, like really quick, and then set your dial, and then, you know, get your reading, and then do your shutter speed and aperture, and then take the picture. It's a slow process, but again, most people like me who enjoys that slow process, who enjoys that full control in manual photography, it's gonna find those meters quite useful. Now the advantage, as I mentioned in 208, is it's got a optional attachment that you can mount to the top of any hot shoe or cold shoe to get a direct readout by pointing this at your subject. The incident reading on this camera gives a 33-degree view. This one gives about, I think, a 46-degree view. So this one gives a slightly wider view, covers about 50-degree lens viewing area. This one covers about 70% of the 50mm lens. Okay, so in terms of the coverage, this one is like pretty much, if I use 50mm lens, no, this is a 28. If I use this lens, if I look through the viewfinder, it's the exact coverage for the 188. And this one is going to give me a slightly less coverage on the 50, which is more equivalent of like a 40mm lens. So there's that. And another advantage, again, that this camera is lacking is a ambient light reading with this little dome over here. So if you put the dome over here, you're going to be doing ambient measuring, which measures the light falls onto the subject. So for example, if I want to take a picture of the light meter right here, instead of pointing my thing over here with the cover on and getting a reading, let's do that. And that measures the reflected light that's bouncing from the light source. So the reflected light is not going to be as accurate as, say, you measure the light directly falling onto the object. So now let's actually cover this, and we're going to do an ambient light reading. But since my camera is here, I'm going to actually point my camera right here, or point the ambient light right here, because that's going to measure the exact same thing, same way that the light is perceived over here from the camera. And as you can see, the actual light falling or getting into the camera is actually much, much lower than the incident reading that we read, which reflected some of the light over there. Okay, so if you do make the exposure, the first shot with the incident light reading, your picture is going to be dark. It's going to be underexposed because it's measuring for this more light right here. It doesn't take into consideration that this is actually the highlight, that when you expose, you want a proper highlight exposure. Now, when we get to this reading with the ambient light readout, it took into consideration of the actual light that is going to be captured by the film. So it's going to give you a more accurate reading with a slower shutter speed. That way, this area is going to be properly exposed. So the ambient reading is much more accurate way of getting exposure reading. And in that term, the 208 is going to give you a much more accurate reading if you use ambient readout. For example, if you're shooting portraits, this is going to be a lot more helpful than this one, because when you point this to the model's face, some of the other area surrounding the model's face is also being metered as well. And if that area is so dark and so light outside of the model, this is going to give you a less accurate reading. And if you're shooting the model, you just put this in front of the model's face and you take a reading. That in turn is going to give you the absolute most accurate reading of the model, taking into consideration of both the background highlight, the background shadows, and the proper exposure of the model's face. So in that regard, this 208 is going to be a lot more accurate than the 188 that's going to able to provide you. Okay, so the choice, again, guys, is yours. If you do a lot of like point and shoot, you're shooting landscape quite a lot, and you're using a full manual camera that does not have a working meter, or you don't trust your meter in your manual camera, for example, the OM1, the meter is usually hit or miss. I'm going to be using the 188, and it's going to serve me perfect. And as you guys can see, the actual reading from 188 is actually exactly matching my OM4 tie. Okay, so I know it's a very accurate meter. I can trust this meter. If you guys do model shoots, if you guys do a lot of portraits, you work very closely with your subject, this ambient light reading is going to really come in very handy for you guys on the 208. Okay, and it's also got the plus side of metering, just like the 188, which is the incident metering, which actually reads the reflected light. Less accurate, but again, it's doable. You just need to know the reflected light, whether you should do a compensation adjustment for the reflected light, and then you should still be able to get an accurate reading as well. But again, my concern with this used unit is it's less accurate. It's uncalibrated, so you have to make sure if you get a used unit, compare with a known working light meter or your camera, digital camera, which is usually more accurate compared to film cameras. Get that accurate reading, calibrate your meter, and then you have a full working meter. And then based on your application, if you shoot, again, use ambient a lot, This is a lot more helpful. It's able to mount onto the top of the hot shoe, but this one just gives a reliable general reading, okay? The choice is yours, which meter is gonna suit you better, but in any regards, all those meters are gonna do the exact same job, which is take a reading and calculate your exposure. Now, I didn't touch up on the price of those units. This one sells brand new in year 2022, much inflated price of, you can get this for $130 plus tax shipped. This one, used secondhand market, you can get this for about $10 to $20. And again, the decision is yours, whether you want to spend 10 times more for a kind of fairly accurate light meter that does ambient metering, or you want to get a super cheap light meter that does reliable metering. The choice is yours. I can't make that choice for you. I hope you found this comprehensive comparison video useful for you guys. And if you did, please do hit the like button or subscribe to my channel. I should have more similar film photography tips and reviews coming out for you guys. So thanks again, and see you guys in the next video. Take care.